first off, thank you very much for having me this evening, and it's a delight to sort of reconnect with the company after quite a few years. And just to give you an idea of what I'm going to talk you through, I'm going to give you a very brief introduction about my career so far, and then talk you through three perhaps of my favourite stories over the past 5 or so years. Hopefully pulling out some interesting tidbits about the industry from each. I will be delighted to answer questions about anything at all that I go across. It may be easier if we save questions till the end. I'm probably going to talk for 20-25 minutes max, and then I'm happy to stay around for as long as the questions last. I'm going to share my screen with you, so I apologize, you may not see me for a while, but I hope that what I show you is more interesting than my face. So thank you again, and just to start off, see if we can. Obviously, this isn't working quite as I'd hoped.
Don't be worried.
Right. You can all see that.
Bingo.
Perfect. Great. So I am a video journalist, and I'm starting to move into documentary film now. I was an Abbott Scholar, very generously supported by the company back in 2011. And so I left City of London School in 2011 and went and studied geography at St John's College, Cambridge, where I was a choral scholar. I spent 3 years mostly inside the chapel, singing a beautiful stained glass window chapel there at Cambridge. While at university, I was really set on moving out to the Middle East afterwards, become a foreign correspondent. At the time, that was really where I saw myself moving career-wise. So I left university and went straight to Beirut, in Lebanon, where the plan was to learn Arabic, to start freelancing, and to really find my feet in the world of international journalism at the time. It was a rather kind of tumultuous few years there. I was there for about 1.5 years, reporting on both the fallout from the war in Syria. There's a huge refugee situation in Lebanon. I also reported from Iraq on the kind of the fight against ISIS and some of the internal politics and divisions within Iraq at the time, especially around minorities. So after about 1.5 years there, very much learning on the go. I never studied journalism or trained through it. I think it's one of those professions that you can really kind of learn on the job. I moved to America to study a master's at Harvard in Middle Eastern Studies, still very much rooted in the region where I thought my career would be anchored. I was there by chance during the entirety of the Trump campaign, which has been fascinating, kind of remembering in the last few months, real roller coaster, as you can imagine. I'm not going to talk about that here, but if anyone has any questions or comparisons, I'm very happy to talk about that afterwards. So after 2 years in the US, with stints in Brussels with the Wall Street Journal covering Brexit, again, kind of there at the worst time, and in Turkey with the Associated Press, I ended up with CNN, which is where I work at the minute. Dividing my time between working on the international desk and the video platforms that we put out online, and also making documentaries independently. So there's 3 stories I'm going to talk you through this evening. They're contrasting, hopefully quite visual, and hopefully give plenty of flavors of kind of the things that I might have done, and a bit of a taste of what the industry's like now, especially for young journalists moving into the world of international journalism. I've never really reported from the UK, and I think as much as people may blur the distinction, there is quite a divide in terms of how we work, and how we work internationally as opposed to domestically. So the first story I'm going to talk about is a story about a young 10-year-old boy, Hassan, in southern Lebanon, and I kind of wanted to tell this story because it started in a very unusual fashion for me. So I wrote it for the for Al Jazeera. At the time I was writing. I've since moved into video and visual mediums. And at the time I was kind of moonlighting in the evenings as an editor for the big English newspaper in Lebanon, the Daily Star. When this picture came across my desk. And in Lebanon, there's obviously been several wars with Israel. There's almost kind of talks about in a matter-of-fact way. People have lived through them generationally, and the violence that both in the conflicts and following on from it is very much an accepted way of life. So that day I was at work. This story came across. Several children have been injured by some unexploded ordnance left over from the 2006 war, and it was very matter-of-factly dealt with. This picture came across. It was a very short article, and it really piqued my curiosity, mainly because it was viewed in such a matter-of-fact way. So I decided to set out and try and find the boy in the picture. And international journalism is very much moved on from the kind of halcyon days of expense accounts, the kind of glory days of trotting around the globe, and being able to kind of live the life of Riley. Now it's very much journalism on a shoestring budget. It's predominantly young freelance journalists. Sadly, most of them come to report on the world from Europe, from America, and it's really kind of living very much hand to mouth week to week. So this is a story that took several weeks of work. I think in total it's about $280. I ended up working home from it. You're definitely not doing it for the money, but really getting a chance to share the stories of people you meet. And so this is Hassan and his brother Muhammad. And myself and a friend tracked down, we had the very barest details about him and his brother, and we tracked him down doing kind of the old traditional kind of shoe leather reporting, wandering around villages, talking to mayors, trying to work out where these children were. Word of mouth still very much, so in any rural setting, very much the rule of the day, and so it was very easy to track them down. And we told the story about how after the war, in the very last hours of the war in 2006, Israel kind of carpet bombed the southern parts of Lebanon with cluster munitions. And despite intensive demining efforts, they still persist these days. In the springtime, when the floods come down from the mountains, these bomblets are washed down into the gullies, and children like these all too often stumble across them with often deadly, certainly very serious consequences. And so I like the story, kind of very much a tale of kind of what, of how journalism has moved on in terms of the freelance, but at the same time very much rooted in the shoe leather of old. The second story that I want to kind of talk to you about is, is very different. So this was a story that I reported for the centenary of World War I when I was working at CNN. And as you can see from the title there, it's looking at, again, the environmental legacy of the conflict. A real challenge for us today in journalism is trying to find engaging ways to retell stories or to tell stories in a very crowded landscape. One of the great joys, I think, of the world today is that you can access so much information online. You can access so many media outlets, each with their own way of telling stories. That, for us as journalists, obviously presents real challenges sometimes in telling stories that we know everyone is going to be focused on. And the centenary of 1918, it's a couple of years ago now, was definitely one of those stories. Something that I found very interesting, was very keen to tell. A lot of the questions that I get asked these days is where does one find stories as a journalist? And I remember going to a job interview and I was asked that question. And I said, well, often I get story ideas from Twitter. And I was kind of laughed at the time. I didn't get the job, but I think there's actually a real value in it. a kind of perhaps a snobbery amongst certain older journalists, the idea of finding stories online, especially on social media. But I think, again, it's one of these incredible tools to connect with all manner of people that we'd never usually connect with. So for me, this story came from a post from a local researcher in Verdun, northeast France, just before the centenary, so about 6 months before, where he'd mentioned this place called La Place à Gaz, the kind of gassy place. And it was kind of held in sort of local folklore that there was a place after the war in 1919 or so, where the Allies had collected all these chemical munitions they'd used during the war, and they decided to burn them as the best way of disposing of these weapons. A great idea at the time. Obviously, with hindsight, proves to be an awful mistake. When they burnt all these munitions, the chemicals inside them seeped down into the soil and completely polluted the landscape. The landscape in Verdun was completely destroyed already. The French government actually walled off an entire swathe of countryside in a so-called red zone to stop locals from returning to their farms, in a very similar situation as in Lebanon actually, returning to their farms and injuring themselves over when they stumbled across shells. And the landscape today, believe it or not, 100 years later, is still full of unexploded munitions from the First World War. The very first day myself and my colleague were in France to film this story, and we'd set out there to try and find La Place à Gaz, to try and see what we could tell around this story and the environmental legacy of the war. This was our way of perhaps retelling the story in a slightly new, hopefully engaging way for our publics. And completely by chance, and this is the real good fortune or bad fortune that goes into journalism, we were staying at the same inn as one of the local demining teams. And so fortunately, I overheard them talking in the morning. We convinced them to let us piggyback along with them during the day. And there's a lot more in the video. I'm happy to share the links of these stories afterwards. You can see a lot more of them at work. But they were in this river in the region, pulling out shells from the First World War that someone had completely by chance discovered the previous summer swimming in the river. And it's a river that was very shallow, kind of perfect bathing spot. Kids were playing there every year. And little did they know, the locals, that the Germans, before they'd left, had tipped cartloads of these shells, you can see here on the screen, into the river. So 100 years later, the team were pulling these out, stacking them up to then destroy them on one of the military sites. This is an extreme example, but really, for me, kind of opened my eyes to actually the scale of the problem. And this is, again, this is in Europe. This is somewhere that hasn't seen conflict for the best part of 70, 80 years now.
Joseph, can I just interrupt?
Yeah.
I'm not seeing any pictures of ammunition. I'm seeing a picture of you, I think, in Istanbul. I don't know if that's just me or is that your...
Sorry, let me...
screen.
No, it's the same. Yeah, I wasn't sure whether to stop the flow. Slide 9 we're seeing.
Apologies. Let me... here we are.
I did see your video before this evening, and it's terrific. It's a really good piece.
Oh, I apologize for that. Here we are. So as you can see here, these are the shells that they pulled out from the river. This really kind of eye-opening display, for me at least, of the scale of the problem. And let me just scroll up to some of the other clips that I thought I was scrolling through. It's an incredible place, and I really encourage any of you to visit if you're so inclined. Unlike the Somme and some of the other sites in northern France, really this whole area was untouched. So when the French government cleared people off, they planted these forests there to dissuade people from moving back to farms, and B, to try and reclaim the landscape in some way. But you only have to wander a few meters off roads crisscrossing the forest there, and you'll wander into areas like this where the trench lines, the shell holes are very, very obvious. Really, really impressive to see, and very much right on kind of our doorstep in Europe. And so this is one of the artillery positions that, again, the nature is quite literally reclaiming. And again, especially for video journalists like me, it's very sad to see some of the data that we get from the website. We have an awful lot of data that we can see how long people are watching videos, how far they're reading in articles. And my kind of slightly melancholic takeaway has been that people are very, very fickle when it comes to news. Very fickle in terms of how, what they'll engage with, how long they'll engage with things. And the flip side of that from the journalist point of view is we have to make things very engaging, very eye-catching, and that can work wonderfully with kind of visuals like this. Unfortunately, for lots of material in TV, often that goes perhaps slightly too far, and there's perhaps a desire to sate people's appetites rather than to concentrate on the news. And moving for me from text into video, that's been a real learning curve and a real kind of realization actually of how that works and why it works best. The next story that I'm going to show you, and I will share that with you now. Again, for me, really plays on that need for engaging visuals, of the need of providing people with something to really latch onto, not just in terms of descriptions, but also far more so in terms of something that they can perhaps engage with and picture themselves here. So I'm half Turkish. I grew up between London and Turkey. And one of the great frustrations for me, and one of the things that really pushed me away from making a career as a foreign correspondent, was the realization perhaps that language skills aren't really what they should be amongst the foreign correspondent's core. One might expect, I think quite reasonably, that most of the foreign correspondents we see on TV speak the languages of the countries they report in, and all too often, sadly, that's not the case. Coming from Turkey, I've really felt that very keenly, that not being able to speak the language, journalists are often missing out on stories that I think really tell the story of that particular country in a way that is most empathetic or most open and accessible for people to really understand what's going on there. This was a story that I decided to do in hopes of trying to achieve that. And it was a story about mosque design. But actually, it was trying to do a lot more than that. It was trying to tell, it was trying to tell a story of modern day politics in Turkey, the move from the very Republican, secular 20th century Turkey into the much more Islamist, populist politics of modern day Turkey. I've cut the sound here, but some of the images, hopefully, as you'll see towards the end of this video, give a real sense of how architecture of mosques is maps out some of the politics. So the story was looking at that mosque you can see there on the left. It's this enormous mosque in Istanbul, sitting right on top of one of the hills overlooking the entire city. It's built in this neo-Ottoman style that harks back to the kind of imperial past that the present government is very keen to espouse. But at the same time, it's built in a very neo-Ottoman style with an emphasis on the neo. And we were contrasting that with the architecture of this mosque, again, built at very similar times. This mosque was built by someone, this architect here, very much of the old traditional Republican secular elite of the country, people that typically were viewed as anti-Islam, anti-faith in general in public life. But more and more so as they've kind of learned to live with the current government, I think at least there's been a real humble acceptance of the day-to-day Islam in life, and it's blossomed out in some of these wonderful examples of architecture here. This is a mosque built outside the city. It wasn't given permission to be inside Istanbul. Obviously very, very modern, but very functional, very well used. During the Friday prayers every week, we just missed a wedding that was there at the time. And for me at least, kind of provide an opportunity to tell the story of this political change through something completely different that may engage more people, hopefully is open to more people and allows more people to get into some of these stories. For me, journalism has always been about engaging people, hopefully providing a way to show the average person on the street in the UK, in the US, wherever that may be, that the people they see on TV, whether that be in a conflict zone, whether that may be in Europe, even with Brexit, are going through very similar experiences as them, are people that they can engage with, and ultimately try and put the viewer or the reader that I'm engaging with in that person's shoes. That's really kind of driven my move into documentaries, into video. I think it's as much as it's wonderful to be able to write 10,000 words about something. Fundamentally, how many people read it, and so I think it's definitely the future. As you see there, CNN's tried to take a multimedia approach, as much as we call it, incorporating video throughout articles, trying to make that really the centerpiece of what we do. And it's interesting working at an American outlet. Obviously, they've got a very different perspective to UK outlets. I've written for a few British papers, and it's really kind of night and day, both on how they see the world, how they engage with it, and there's plenty of positives and negatives on both sides. Working in TV as well is very much part of the old world of media now. CNN, they're moving away very slowly, moving away from the sense of TV as being their bread and butter to moving much more towards a world of online engagement, online readership. And that has had a huge effect on everything. It's driven most of the things I've been talking about there. It's driven the move towards freelancing. It's driven the move towards a more fickle audience, perhaps, which has had plenty of benefits in terms of how we do journalism as well. Really trying to think about how we both best engage people, best get people interested in the important stories of the day, rather than sit in kind of perhaps an ivory tower where we've had the luxury of being able to do that in the past. We really have, whether we like it or not, have had our eyes opened to what people want to see, what people really engage with. And for better or worse, I think definitely for better, that's transforming the way we do journalism, much more centered around how we keep eyes on the page, on the stories, and ultimately on the issues that we report on, much more than in the past. And that's, I'm sure it's been a bit of a whirlwind tour through those three stories. I hope that was not too disruptive with the screen sharing, but I'm really looking forward to your questions, and I'm very happy to answer anything and everything you may like to ask. So thank you very much for having me, and thank you.
Okay. Okay, yeah.
Very good indeed.
Quite interesting, that.
Yeah, very nice.
Very interesting. Any questions now? Anybody? Everybody?
Is it possible to get to be able to just find these stories that you put on the web nowadays with just an ordinary laptop?
Yes, of course. Yeah, I'll ask. Well, I'll send the links through to Paul, and hopefully he can email them around. But yes, they're all accessible, and yeah, feel free to have a watch. I'm sure hopefully they do a better way of telling the stories than I have done there.
Well, I think you've done very well indeed, but I'll be very interested to see how that little lad gets on. Do you follow anything up afterwards, sort of a year later or anything?
Yes, it really varies story to story. Often time situations don't necessarily allow it. Sometimes they do, but I tend to try and stay in contact with people as much as possible. So I know that his family is kind of quite a static lifestyle. They're still very much in the village farming. The situation there in terms of landmines, for instance, hasn't changed much. You may have seen in the headlines, Lebanon's going through an awful lot of financial, political trouble in the last few years, and that's only stymied efforts to clear the landscape there. But Hassan's doing well, and he's still at school now, but not for much longer, I imagine. And yeah, I always try to, at least.
Well done, thank you.
Oh, that's good. Interesting.
So Joseph, can I ask you a question? I'm not quite clear in my mind whether you work for CNN now or you are still freelance. But my question really is around sort of access to these stories. When you approach a story, and obviously you showed us 3 success stories, it can't always be like that, and you must get pushback. Where does that pushback come from? Because you're a journalist, because you're working for CNN, because you're British, if you are British, I'm not sure. What are the obstacles that you face, and some examples where you haven't been able to get the story you're looking for?
So actually the answer ties into both things you've inquired about there. So I'm, like most of the newsroom at CNN, I'm actually a freelance producer for CNN. The core, perhaps the core staff, full-time, fully employed benefits, all this kind of, the benefits that go with typical salaried jobs. There's a very, very small number in the newsroom, at least, on those kind of contracts. Bizarrely, most of the people making the news are freelance, whereas all the kind of backroom staff aren't. And that's something that the industry has kind of moved into in the last 20 years or so. And so that goes hand in hand with what you said secondly there. Being freelance, the onus is very much on the individual journalist to find stories. So right from day one, when I picked up a pen, there was the expectation that I would be finding stories to present to editors for their approval. So I guess when I was starting, perhaps 1 in 10 stories I might find hit the mark and was commissioned. These days, I hope it's down towards, or up towards, I don't know, 7, 8 out of 10. But rejection is very much part of the game. And that comes, probably the hardest felt for us is from editors, because we feel we've put a lot of work into finding these stories before hopefully getting the access to then present to editors. But there are definitely stories that stumble. Often it's not necessarily access. You might be able to find people to back up stories. I've done some investigative work the last few years, and there's much more an investment of time you put in there at the front end to try and get this access. And thinking of one story there where, which hasn't yet been commissioned, we found some women who've undergone unnecessary surgeries, some unnecessary surgeries around childbirth in Lebanon and as refugees. And we found them very willing to talk about their stories. What we haven't necessarily found is people within the medical system who've been willing to go on record to talk about these things. There's obviously a spectrum. We can do the story with people talking off the record on background. We can have people talking to it, but that is often the most difficult, but ultimately the most kind of rewarding obstacle to overcome.
Mm.
That's true. Surgeries, yeah.
Thank you.
Mm.
What's your next event? What's your next story, do you think?
So I was weighing up whether I can show you the first couple of minutes of now, but I've just been directing, in the summer we were shooting, myself and a colleague, a documentary in in Sicily during COVID, which presented a whole range of obstacles. We were weighing up whether or not to even do it because of the need to travel out there. But it's a story about a young 10-year-old girl who is part of a program in Palermo where they're trying to integrate the migrant community. There's a huge, very multicultural migrant community in Palermo, trying to integrate them into Italian society proper through music, through the opera house. And so there's a choir of migrant children attached to the opera house. She's a member of it. And we followed them from the summer as they just came out of lockdown through the rehearsals, and they had their first performance in September. And it's not yet come out, but hopefully in December it'll be commissioned. We're still pitching that now, having filmed it, having edited it. And that's the next project I'm working on. Very excited. It's, just today, actually, kind of put it all together for the first time. And so very much looking forward to getting that out in the next month or so.
Mm-hmm. That's a wonderful, very imaginative a way to integrate, actually. Quite impressive.
Mm. It is. They took a very, obviously Italy in the last few years, there's been a real backlash against migration within the country. And Palermo has kind of stood out as this one beacon of pro-migrant policies in Italy. One of the really interesting things we found was the mayor, who's been this kind of crusader for the migrants in the city. He was famed for having beaten the mafia back in the 90s. So very much one of these crusader types. He's taken on this new challenge, and as well as it's gone over the last few years, it's beginning to have a backlash now from his own kind of constituency, where they feel he's putting too much emphasis on migrant initiatives, on welcoming people, rather than fixing potholes, picking up rubbish in the street. And wandering around the city, you can definitely see why people are starting to feel that way. So a really interesting dynamic going on there.
Thank you.
Joseph, I was interested by your comments on the linguistic skills or lack thereof of many foreign correspondents today. Is it improving or going downhill? And presumably you are fluent, as well as fluent in English, you are fluent in French and Turkish yourself?
So I've been very fortunate, both at City and my master's in kind of studying languages. And yeah, I speak Turkish and French and smattering of a couple of other languages. And
Arabic as well?
My Arabic was good when I was there. It's been a few years since, and it's starting to dip. But the story that I'm very much hoping to do next year in Iraq, kind of COVID willing. So I'm in the midst of reviving that, blowing the dust off the textbooks and getting back into that. And it's, in answer to your first question, it is improving, but it's improving in an unexpected way, in the sense that really now there's a generation, my kind of generation, I don't necessarily include myself in this, of young reporters who are quote unquote native. A friend of mine who works at the Washington Post, she's Syrian, most of them studied in the West, in America, in Europe. So they speak and they write brilliantly in English. They're very much kind of culturally on the same playing field as young Americans say, so they can talk to American, British, European audiences, but they have that real knack and understanding of the countries they're actually reporting in. And it kind of seems nonsensical, but for 150 years or so, we've been sending people into countries which they don't know, and as much as you can read around it, fundamentally, we would find it very strange if our news was being given to us, or if foreign journalists were coming into the UK to report on Brexit, to report on Westminster, who didn't speak English, for instance. It would just be absolutely unfathomable for us. So that change is slowly happening now, and it's not really necessarily been one that I think has been done institutionally. I think it's happening quite naturally that many of the really strong journalists of my generation are come from the countries that they're now reporting on.
What are your views on the mosquification of Hagia Sophia?
It's interesting. This is as long as I've been going to Turkey, there's been this kind of, well, at least in the last 25 years or 20 years ago, there's been this debate around its status. It's something that very much fits into the narrative of President Erdogan as being, he likes very much to pit himself as the man who's bringing back Islam into the public sphere in Turkey. And as much as he's open to criticism now, I mean, he is genuinely popular. I mean, we saw something similar with now President Trump the last week or so, where as much as the international media might like to trash him, there's an awful lot of people in the country who are willing to vote for him, come out for him. Whether or not they'll say it in public, they'll go and vote at the ballot box for him. And it's very similar in Turkey. As loathsome as plenty of the things he does are, he is very popular. And initially, at least, was very liberalizing. Very much fought back against the real attacks on freedom of religion under the previous kind of era of Republican rule, where women who were Muslim weren't allowed to go to university with a headscarf. They couldn't get jobs in most public sectors with a headscarf. Things like that, very day-to-day freedoms, liberties that were infringed upon. He initially undid those and was very widely accepted by lots of people who are very much against him now. So Hagia Sophia is a perfect example now where it was very much the last domino to fall, if you like. This was something that was very much viewed as anathema for decades. You can't turn this site of republicanism back into a mosque. He's done it. He's got the power to do it, and definitely reveled in it. I don't think it's changed anything for the day-to-day lives of Turks, but very much had a real resonance in that kind of narrative sphere he's operating in. I don't think it will necessarily help him at the polls, but it won't do him any harm.
I'm in sporadic correspondence with a chap called Ian Sherwood, who is the Archbishop of Canterbury's Apocrypharius to the Ecumenical Patriarch in Constantinople, and also runs the Crimean War Memorial Church, which he rededicated. And he said that actually visiting Hagia Sophia now is a lot easier and better and inspiring than it was when it was just a museum.
Well, the one irony has been that whereas before you needed to buy a ticket to go in, now as it's a mosque there are no tickets, so you can wander in as you please. That's perhaps the one upside to it.
I better let somebody else ask a question. I've said too much.
Turkey's foreign policy is changing, isn't it? It's getting more muscle at the moment. How do you see that affecting the people living in Turkey going forwards?
It's a great question. It's not one that I've thought about much. I mean, Turkey is an enormous country. It really takes days to drive across it. It's got a similar population to the UK, but a quarter of the population lives in Istanbul, in one city. And they are, it feels a world away from the borders. I mean, it borders Syria, Iraq, Armenia, Georgia, and it really feels a world away from that when you're in Istanbul. So for most people, given that Turkey's foreign policy is getting more perhaps aggressive, I think muscled, or flexing their muscles is perhaps a better way of putting it. That's very much on the eastern, the southern borders, which are, as I said, kind of so far away from most people in Turkey that it doesn't necessarily change that much for the everyday Turk. I think where people do feel the bite, if you like, is very much in their pockets, in the economy. It's not directly tied to foreign policy, but as Turkey has pursued a much more independent path, we might say, very much distinct from Western policy goals. They've also suffered economically because the US investors in general aren't as willing to put as much money into the economy. And that's really had a huge effect on currency value in Turkey. Really devastating effect. And that's something that the people have felt. A lot of people who vote for President Erdogan, very supportive of his foreign policy. They view it as kind of not reclaiming any territorial land. Some people might like that, but very much reclaiming that position of being a major actor in the region, of having that heft to be able to dictate terms, whether it be in the conflict now between Armenia and Azerbaijan, plenty of Turkish weapons, muscle going in there, but also Syria, Iraq, Iran. In the Mediterranean, plenty of gas and oil discoveries there that Turkey is kind of muscling its way in on. It's that kind of sense of power on the international stage, which I think is quite addictive for the average Turk.
Do you think the lifestyle is it's more dangerous to live there? Do you think some of these countries will retaliate?
No, I don't think so. No more dangerous than Europe, and I say that quite deliberately because I think the only real danger that I see is from terrorism, in the same way that here in Paris, in London, in most European cities, there's a similar danger. I think, despite the fact that Turkey's had this ongoing insurgency with Kurdish groups for decades now, it's seen no. I think of the figures, but it's seen no greater loss of life or number of attacks than London, say, in the past 10 years. And that's very easy to forget, I think, even for me, but definitely not a sense of danger at all. I think the only danger people feel is it's a huge problem of violence against women, which is something that lots of societies deal with, but in Turkey it's particularly bad. A real sense of masculinity in the home, and that is has toxic and deadly results for many women in the country.
It's interesting. I had a former colleague who was Turkish, but she was a Jewish lady, and she said to me, I didn't sort of go too far because it was obviously quite sensitive, but she took her family out of Turkey and has gone to Israel. She found it was just impossible to live there anymore.
It's changed an awful lot. Day-to-day life has changed an awful lot. I think in the past years. I remember very distinctly. I was in Brussels when there was the attempted coup a few years ago. But then the week after the coup, I went back to Istanbul to do some reporting, and it was really shocking. I mean, it was an event that had huge. It was a real earthquake politically and society in the country. All these crackdowns afterwards, but walking through the metro system in Istanbul, there were propaganda posters on every single advertising board. There were the songs they'd written about the people who'd stood up against the pushists. And there was a real sense of kind of 1984 stepping into it, that kind of world for the first time. I think that's the change that has really affected people. I have family members in academia who have either retired or left the country for similar reasons because they don't feel that they have the same freedoms to be able to express themselves. They're very much on their toes, and that sense of being on edge is something that I think is very much in society now in a way that it definitely wasn't 20 years ago, for most people at least.
Changing the topic a little bit, I don't know whether you treat yourself as British. I still haven't quite understood whether you're Turkish, British, French or whatever. but how does British journalists sort of fare in the Middle East, not just Turkey, but the Middle East as a whole? I mean, we see some incredible characters on our television sets. The Orla Gerrans, okay, she's Irish, I know, but there's the other guy who I can't remember, who reports from Syria often, whose name I forget. I mean, how do the British, and how does the British sort of flavor work in the Middle East today?
It's interesting. So I'm very proudly kind of British. Kind of grew up in London, and definitely to most people I meet, that's what they see and hear first. It can change and vary very much country to country and situation to situation. Personally, I've never had issues on a British passport, and I don't think I know anyone that does. That said, there are certain countries where you know you're going to have issues. Iran is one that's very difficult to operate in. There was
you go to Iran, do you?
Sorry, no, I've never worked from there. No. But colleagues you have, and there was a colleague I was working with at Harvard who'd just been released from Iranian captivity. He'd been held hostage there for the best part of a year. He's American. It's obviously slightly different, but there was a real awareness that in itself is a very difficult country to work in. So in general, it's very easy. We have a huge luxury and privilege to be able to swan in and out of most countries in the Middle East without problems on a British passport, say on a Western passport. The one thing that it really is beginning to start to chafe is a general crackdown on journalism, on the freedom of press in the region. So obviously working in Lebanon, in Turkey, you need a visa, you need press accreditation. You are ultimately dependent on the government to give you these things. And historically, they've been very willing, perhaps surprisingly, to give these documents out. Increasingly, recently, they've seen that refusing accreditation is a very easy way of forcing journalists, specific journalists, out of the country. And it's a way that often does it without the headlines you might have, without the embassy involvement. You're not deporting someone, you're just not renewing their visa. There are ways around it, and you'll find plenty, especially young freelance journalists working on tourist visas. Beirut was a hotbed of it, people living there and every 3 months popping across to Cyprus for a day to renew their 3-month visa. I'm sure COVID has affected that, but I think that's where the passport itself is beginning to be an obstacle in some ways. But in general, the people everywhere I've met have always been very, 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 very welcoming. People will turn around and say you're a spy in conversation, but I've never had, that's kind of like turning around and saying, well, all Americans are ignorant. Again, something completely...
Well, about 50% of them are, I think.
One of these lines that's thrown around with ease. And I've never had a problem with that. And I think if you present yourself as open to people, I've always had very positive reactions back.
Right. Good for you.
Bill?
You're on mute.
I think it's time for us to draw things to a close. As Prime Warden and Master-elect, it falls to me to thank you, Joseph, for an absolutely fascinating discourse, to thank you on behalf of all your viewers, who gave us amazing insights into the life of a foreign correspondent. And I can only say that we glass sellers can be proud of the fact that in a very small way, we've helped you on the road to an excellent and clearly developing career. And we wish you increasing success in the future and expect to see you as one of the world's leading documentary makers in a short time. Thank you very much. And I ask you all to clap.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you so much for your attention, your questions, and thank you for having me. And once again, as I said at the beginning, it was really thanks to the Abbott Scholarship that my time at university was as profitable as it was, and I have you all to thank for that. And I'm very glad to see that the program is still very much up and running, and it's wonderful to be reconnecting with you all. So thank you from me.
Very good.
Quick final question, can I ask, Joseph? Have you ever met Ian Sherwood in Istanbul? If not, next time you go there, do look him up. He's a most eccentric and interesting character.
No, I haven't, but I will make sure to do that on my next.
It's the Church of the Resurrection at the Crimean War Memorial Church.
I know what you mean, yeah.
Chaplain to the consulate at St Helens Chapel. Anyhow, thank you again very much.
Thank you all.
Yep. Very good.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
All the
Thanks,
best.
Paul.
Take care, everyone.
Well, everybody take care. And we're actually online on Monday next week, looking at helping you with your social media connections and professional networking on LinkedIn.
Oh.
So we'll look forward to seeing you then. You'll get the details later today.
What time will that be, Paul?
It'll be 7 o'clock on Monday night. Details going out later on this evening.
This afternoon I'll have what you've had, Paul.
Graham, haven't we got a meeting that day?
Oh, Monday, yes, we have. Yes, at 7:30. Yes.
7:30, right?
Right. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, we'll say good night to everybody, and thank you very much.
Everybody.
Joseph, all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph. We'll be in touch.
Thanks, Joseph.
Good night. God bless everybody.